Do I have a story to tell? In 1966, the following item appeared in the newsletter of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Atlanta. Dial a slur from Lester Maddox. Call a phone number and hear a personal diatribe against the Unitarian Universalists from Lester Maddox, Georgia's leading segregationist, and as we now know, many years later, Georgia's future governor. So how did the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Atlanta achieve this infamous status? Do I have a story to tell? One of my great joys in learning about Unitarian Universalism is learning about our prophetic role in racial justice and other forms of prophetic witness. Ours is not a perfect story, far from it, but we have clearly been on the leading edge. This morning, I will share some of our stories from right here in Atlanta, and then I will transition to the Unitarian Universalist response to the events in Selma, Alabama in 1965. When I was in seminary in the mid-1990s, I wrote a research paper on the Unitarian Universalist contributions to race relations in Atlanta. In that paper, I told the story of the Reverend George Leonard Cheney, who in 1881 traveled south from Massachusetts and founded the Church of Our Father, Unitarian, in 1883. Cheney helped found or served as a trustee of the Hampton Institute, the Tuskegee Normal Institute, Atlanta University, and the Georgia Institute of Technology. Cheney used the Atlanta Church, located at North Forsyth and Church Streets, now Carnegie Way, as the first free lending library open to both blacks and women. In 1899, the church property was purchased by the Carnegie Library, and it is today at the location of the Central Branch of the Atlanta Fulton County Public Library. This auspicious beginning, though, was not to last. In 1948, the congregation, then named the United Liberal Church, split over whether blacks would be admitted as members. In 1951, the American Unitarian Association, who owned the mortgage to their building now on West Peachtree Street, sold the property, effectively closing a segregated church. In less than a year, the AUA, the American Unitarian Association, sent the Reverend Glenn Canfield to Atlanta. He was given two names, one of which was the mother of Peggy Beard, a founding member of Emerson, this congregation. From a list of members who wanted an integrated church, meetings were first held in the home of Reverend Canfield, and then in the Briarcliff Hotel in downtown Atlanta. It's still there. They met for almost a year until hotel residents complained because blacks were using the front elevators to go to church. A home to both Unitarians and Universalists, the growing congregation, with the help from both the Unitarian and Universalist national offices, purchased a building from the Mormon Church on the corner of North Avenue and Boulevard downtown. The new United Liberal Church was officially chartered on January the 20th, 1954. The Constitution of the United Liberal Church stated, "Any person, regardless of race, color, nationality, or station in life, is eligible for membership in this church." I absolutely believe that the United Liberal Church in January 1954 was the first integrated church in Atlanta. Whitney Young, chair of the School of Social Work at Atlanta University, joined in late 1954. You may know that he went on to lead the National Urban League. Black college students from Atlanta University, Morehouse College, Morris Brown, and Spelman were frequent visitors. In 1957, the Reverend Ed Cahill came to Atlanta from Charlotte, North Carolina, to serve the United Liberal Church. The opening words at his installation were given by Dr. Rufus E. Clement, the black president of Atlanta University and a member of the United Liberal Church. Frederick May Elliott, president of the AUA, delivered the installation sermon. And Atlanta Mayor William B. Hartsfield offered words of welcome at this service of installation. When an integrated reception was held for the Cahills in Avondale, an eastern suburb of Atlanta, neighbors called the police, and two church members of the United Liberal Church who worked for the city, Betty Hamling and Morgan Stanford, lost their jobs. The youth group of the United Liberal Church held joint meetings with the youth of Ebenezer Baptist Church, the youth group under the direction of Coretta Scott King. When the Klan threatened violence at a joint meeting to be held at the United Liberal Church, Mrs. King was consulted, and they decided to go ahead with the meeting. All parents were called, and they supported the decision to meet. That evening, the fathers came and formed a ring outside the church, creating a visible wall of protection. In writing my seminary paper, I called Robert Chaikin, a member of the youth group in the early 1960s. Chaikin recalled when Dr. Samuel Williams, minister of Friendship Baptist Church, professor of philosophy at Morehouse College, and president of the Atlanta NAACP, came and spoke to the youth group. When Chaikin asked Williams about the white supremacist charge that ill-equipped blacks would bring down the school system, Williams retorted, "Get off my back and I'll get out of the ditch." Chaikin was impressed. Reverend Williams, Rabbi Racob Rothschild, and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. all spoke from the pulpit of the United Liberal Church. As the church continued to grow, the Reverend Eugene Pickett came to Atlanta in 1962 to serve the congregation. In search for larger space, the church made offers, but were turned down twice because, and this is a quote, "an integrated church would lower the moral tone of the neighborhood." I've left out dozens of ways that the United Liberal Church, the forerunner to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Atlanta, supported the civil rights movement. By 1965, the civil rights movement was in full swing and was gaining increased national attention following the 1963 broadcast of police dogs and water cannons used against protesters, demonstrators, marchers in Birmingham, Alabama. Also that same year, King's letter from a Birmingham jail, the murder of NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers in Mississippi, the March on Washington with King's "I Have a Dream" speech, and the bombing of the 16th Street Church in Birmingham that killed 4 little girls. In 1964, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, began a voter registration effort in Selma, Alabama. There were 15,000 black residents in Selma, Alabama, and only 300 of the 15,000 were registered to vote. SNCC had work to do. Violence, intimidation, and scandalous voter registration tests were rampant. By the end of 1964, they turned to the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and Martin Luther King for help. More and more of the residents of Selma and nearby communities were marching for the right to vote. In nearby Marion, Alabama, Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot point blank by an Alabama state trooper while he was trying to protect his mother from a violent attack. He died 8 days later. Marchers wanted to carry their protest to Montgomery, the Alabama state capital, and the SCLC planned a symbolic march from Selma to Montgomery. Alabama Governor George Wallace would have nothing of it, and he ordered that the march be stopped. 600 gathered at Brown Chapel, AME, African Methodist Episcopal, on Sunday, March 7th. Martin Luther King was preaching in Atlanta, and the march was led by John Lewis and Hosea Williams. When marchers reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge outside of Selma, they were ordered to disperse. Almost immediately after that order, and I've watched the film last night, and this is not the film Selma. This is the actual footage of what happened. Almost immediately, the police approached the marchers, pushing them to the ground and beating them. Then came the police on horseback and more beatings. And then there was tear gas followed by more beatings. This became known as Bloody Sunday. It was all captured on film, and national networks interrupted their programs to show what had transpired at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. On the Monday after Bloody Sunday, Reverend King sent his telegram calling on clergy of all faiths to join me in Selma. The Unitarian Universalist ministers and seminarians from all over the country responded to King's call. The second march was scheduled for Tuesday, March 9th, but a federal district judge issued an injunction against the march pending a hearing. Uncertain about whether they would march, people gathered at Brown Chapel. Francis Anderson, the UU minister in Braintree, Massachusetts, found a place in line. As instructed, he positioned himself on the outside of a row of marchers, protecting those on the inside. And at the other end of his row was a nun. Between us, he writes, stood an old man, his arm in a crude sling, and a boy, maybe 12, 13, with a bandage around his head. They had been there for the beating 2 days before. They came back. 2,500 marchers set off. As they marched, a federal marshal read the injunction. With 500 blue-helmeted Alabama state troopers in front of them, the march stopped at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The group knelt and prayed, and Martin Luther King Jr. led the group back to Selma. It was the right decision. Others were still arriving in Selma. Negotiation was still possible. That evening, Unitarian Universalist minister James Reeb called home. Everything had gone well. He would be home soon. Later that evening, Reeb and other UU ministers headed to Walker's Cafe, recommended by the SCLC. It was filled with black locals and white protesters, many Unitarian Universalists. After dinner, Reeb, Clark Olson, and Orloff Miller left the restaurant. They took a wrong turn on the route back to Brown Chapel. Four or five white locals came out of a store behind them and began yelling at them. The UU ministers sped up, but the men ran after them and attacked them from behind. One had either a baseball bat or a length of pipe. Clark Olson witnessed the blow against the head of James Reeb. All three men were beaten and kicked. Within 48 hours, the Reverend James Reeb was dead. President Lyndon Johnson called Mrs. Reeb to offer his condolences, as did Martin Luther King. A number of memorial services were offered for James Reeb, and other UU ministers mentioned his death in their Sunday services. The minister in Birmingham, Larry McGinty, noted the attention given to the death of James Reeb, a white minister, and stated nobody really cared or got upset about Jimmy Lee Jackson. On Monday, March 15th, Martin Luther King Jr. gave the eulogy for James Reeb in Selma to a throng of dignitaries. His crime, said King, was that he dared to live his faith. On March 17th, the federal judge indicated he would allow the march and ordered it to be protected by both the state and federal government. It would take place on Sunday, March the 21st. As Sunday approached in Selma, organizers scrambled to assemble the necessities for a 5-day march from Selma to Montgomery. In Atlanta, UU Minister Eugene Pickett put out the call for members of the United Liberal Congregation, or probably the United Liberal Church, in Atlanta to go if they could, or send blankets if they couldn't. The church telephone tree went into action, and in a single Sunday, church members supplied 250 blankets. On Sunday, March 21st, 1965, the marchers set out, led by Martin and Coretta King, with 3,200 marchers. On the final day of the march, 30,000 marched into Montgomery, including 500 Unitarian Universalist laypeople. The march was a milestone, but it was far from victory and certainly not the end of tragedy or loss. Viola Liuzzo was a Unitarian Universalist from Detroit and a mother of 5 who came to Selma on her own, alone, despite her family's protests. After the march, she ferried marchers back from Montgomery to Selma. As she was heading back to Montgomery to do another shuttle run, a car pulled up beside her, and a gunman shot her in the head, killing her instantly. All told, more than 177 Unitarian Universalist ministers and seminarians journeyed to Selma or Montgomery. It is a proud moment in Unitarian Universalist history. Many of the details I have related came from the Reverend Mark Morrison Reed's book, The Selma Awakening, and his title is important. He documents that Unitarian Universalists were sometimes leaders and sometimes not in the call for racial justice, noting that in the 20th century, black Unitarian Universalist clergy, the few that there were, had difficulty finding placement in our congregations, but that Selma was a turning point for us, thus the Selma Awakening. And I will tell you that it would not end our struggle with racial justice if you know the events of 1968, which are not part of this sermon. It's a good story. At the beginning of the sermon, I stated that Unitarian Universalists have clearly been on the edge, the leading edge of racial justice. I believe we still are. As a religious tradition, we are more sympathetic to the plights of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and others than any other faith community that is historically and predominantly white. We may not be in complete agreement about how we understand the events that led to the deaths of the 3 men I just mentioned. But the shared concern that we have for these tragedies is much greater than any disagreement we may have. I am okay with different perspectives we may bring because, and I believe Emerson is a perfect example of this, we can have a respectful and meaningful dialogue about these tragic events, dialogues that cannot happen in other faith communities. And yet I feel there is much more we could do today. I am convinced that Emerson is ready to take its rightful place as a voice for justice in Cobb County and in Georgia. We have now been in this building almost 9 months, and we are poised to do great things in our community, and the needs are great. We have phenomenal staff, as you've heard this morning, and so it is my hope that we can build on a proud past of social justice and increasingly be the bright beacon of our liberal faith in the 21st century. May it be so.